has just announced a sweeping new tariff on cars.
This is very modest. And what we're going to be doing is a 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States. If they're made in the United States, there's absolutely no tariff.
What if the world's quietest country just turned the global economy on its head without firing a single shot? While all eyes were on China, it was Canada that pulled the trigger. And in less than a day, North America's auto industry was thrown into chaos. Tesla's critical supply chain cut. Ford's assembly lines slowed to a crawl. The American dream of clean energy and manufacturing resurgence undermined by a country we thought was on our side. This isn't fiction. It's a blueprint for collapse, and it began with a single signature in Ottawa. So how did Tesla become the first casualty? Why is Japan suddenly making more American cars than Detroit? And what if this isn't just a trade dispute, but the unraveling of US industrial dominance? Tesla has always walked a fine line between genius and volatility. Its success didn't rest solely on innovation, but on precision. Parts arriving just in time, materials sourced globally, and logistics flowing like clockwork. But that clock just stopped. Within 72 hours of Canada's new mineral export restrictions, the shockwaves hit Tesla's gigafactories in Nevada and Texas. These massive battery plants, the lifeblood of Tesla's operations, were suddenly facing a supply drought. Nickel exports from Canadian mines were frozen for compliance verification. Lithium shipments slowed due to new inspection requirements. Aluminum processing partners across the border warned of delays and rising costs caused by regulatory shakeups. Even if these moves were temporary, it didn't matter. Tesla's entire business model depends on reliability. Temporary isn't built into its DNA. Suppliers hiked their prices overnight. Tesla's procurement teams scrambled to find alternatives in Australia, South America, and even China, a country Tesla had spent years trying to distance itself from. But supply chains aren't plug and play. They're living ecosystems. And Tesla's was collapsing. The financial markets were the first to feel the impact. Analysts downgraded Tesla's outlook. Media outlets questioned whether this was the beginning of the end for the EV giant. Elon Musk, known for his defiant social media presence, tried to fight the narrative. But this time, bravado wasn't enough. Because this wasn't about optics. It was about operations. Production timelines slipped. Battery output lagged. Final assembly slowed. Tesla's once unshakable promise of innovation at scale was cracking, because the essential materials were simply no longer there. And yet, the bigger story was unfolding quietly, at the border. While headlines focused on trade and minerals, a more subtle but devastating tactic emerged: bureaucratic warfare. Mark Carney, Canada's former central banker and now economic strategist, understood something powerful. You don't need to break trade laws to paralyze an industry. You just have to enforce them, relentlessly. Canadian customs officials didn't rewrite rules. They simply applied existing ones with a new level of intensity. Shipments that once crossed the border in hours were now delayed for random inspections. Truckers were stalled for 12 to 24 hours. Train cars were held without explanation. Ports quietly shifted their shipping priorities, and paperwork, previously routine, was now subjected to line-by-line audits. To the outside world, it looked like business as usual. But inside the logistics departments of Tesla, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, the message was unmistakable. Canada had changed the rules of the game. Critical parts arrived late. Production windows were missed. Repair centers ran out of stock. EVs slated for delivery in April were now pushed to July. And Tesla's crisis became a warning siren. Canada wasn't just retaliating, it was strategically dismantling one of the most advanced industrial ecosystems in the world. And doing it all within the bounds of international law. China watched, Japan watched, Germany sent observers. This wasn't a trade disagreement, it was an economic masterstroke. A lesson in how to wage modern war without ever raising a weapon. And then came the knockout punch. Canada's new Democratic Party, buoyed by rising nationalist energy and the chaos it had helped unleash, pushed through a bill that shook the EV world. a 100% tariff on Tesla vehicles imported into Canada, effective immediately. And on top of that, a $10,000 subsidy for any EV made entirely within Canada. The effect was immediate and seismic. Tesla wasn't just penalized, it was replaced. Ford, which already had EV manufacturing in Ontario, saw a surge in demand. General Motors, with battery operations in Canada, became a regulatory favorite. Even Volkswagen fast-tracked its plans for a battery plant in Ontario. Tesla, once the darling of clean energy, was now a pariah, priced out of the Canadian market, locked out of key resources, and stripped of subsidies. This wasn't just a shift in policy. This was economic warfare, not conventional, not about tariffs alone. This was green nationalism, a bold new strategy where environmental goals are wielded as geopolitical weapons, where carbon neutrality becomes a tool of national dominance. And Tesla, the symbol of a cleaner, tech-driven future, became the first victim of a new kind of conflict. The Green Revolution's champion had become the outsider. Canada had changed the game. Electric vehicles weren't just about saving the planet anymore. They were about saving local economies, strengthening domestic industries, and penalizing those who tried to lead without collaboration. And Mark Carney wasn't finished. If you've read this far, you care about where transportation is heading, and so do we. Hit subscribe to stay on top of every shift, every shakeup, and every story that matters to writers and real-world thinkers like you. Carney's coup. While Tesla scrambled to adapt and the US government spun into crisis mode, Mark Carney began reshaping the future of the Western Hemisphere, one trade agreement at a time. Carney didn't become a global economic force by chance. Before rising to Canada's highest office, he led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, two of the world's most influential central banks. He's not a conventional politician. He's a strategist. And in the chaos of America's reactionary trade politics, Carney wasn't reacting. He was orchestrating. Where Donald Trump relied on bombastic threats and blunt policy tools, Carney used precision, subtlety, and a calm demeanor. At a World Trade Forum in Seoul, he didn't shout to be heard. He positioned Canada as a voice of stability. He didn't blame or provoke. He reframed the moment. Canada, he said, was committed to fair trade, climate goals, and the rules-based global order. And the world listened. Asia responded first. Japanese and South Korean automakers, frustrated by US protectionism and trade uncertainty, began seeking Canadian partnerships. In Europe, Carney's cool, composed contrast to Trump's fiery unpredictability made headlines. French and German finance ministers met with him not to negotiate, but to align. In Latin America, Brazil and Chile entered formal discussions with Canada to deepen trade ties for rare earths and clean technology. Canada no longer looked like a supporting player. It was emerging as a global hub. The media began calling it the Carney Doctrine, a strategy rooted in environmental responsibility, fair trade, and calculated influence. While Trump tweeted, Carney built coalitions, and the results were quiet, but devastating. America wasn't just being outpaced, it was being redefined. Canada was no longer the junior partner. It was setting the rules, and Carney wasn't working alone. North America without America. The most dangerous shifts are the silent ones. While Washington was preoccupied with political gridlock and international flare-ups, a new economic map was being redrawn, and the US wasn't on it. Behind closed doors, Canadian and Mexican officials began re-engineering trade infrastructure, not symbolically, but physically. New battery factories were being planned along the Ontario-Quebec corridor. Advanced EV parts hubs were rising across the Mexican states of Nuevo León and Jalisco. Japanese and South Korean firms weren't waiting for Washington's green light. They were moving billions into this new Canada-Mexico trade axis. A pipeline of production was forming, and it bypassed the US entirely. Shipping routes were adjusted, customs systems were streamlined. A joint tax credit plan was proposed, rewarding auto components sourced entirely within this growing bloc. Ford expanded its Canadian operations. Hyundai doubled its logistics capacity in Mexico. Meanwhile, in Ohio and Michigan, warehouses went quiet. This wasn't a punishment. it was a replacement. The US, once the gravitational center of North American auto manufacturing, was now floating on the sidelines. Not by mistake, but by design. And then Europe chose its side. Europe walks away from American cars. There was a time when Europe looked to the US for leadership. Made in America meant something. It stood for innovation, reliability, and strong alliances. But years of tariffs, erratic policy swings, and political dysfunction had transformed that symbol of trust into a warning sign. Europe wasn't retaliating, it was evolving. As Washington played short-term economic games, Brussels started playing the long game. Germany canceled a planned Volkswagen plant in Georgia and moved it to the Netherlands, closer to stability. Renault turned away from American suppliers and partnered with South Korean firms. The UK quietly weighed excluding US-made EVs from its climate subsidies, not out of hostility, but out of caution. America hadn't just become unpredictable. In the eyes of European boardrooms, it had become irrelevant. One EU trade official put it plainly: "We've outgrown dependence on countries that can't outgrow their own politics." And the market began to reflect that shift. Ford's momentum stalled. GM's rebound in Europe fizzled. Tesla, once a darling of the continent, saw its advertising budgets vanish in France and Germany. This wasn't backlash, it was boredom. Hyundai, Toyota, and even Chinese brands filled the space with quiet competence. What we're witnessing isn't a dramatic breakup, it's a transition. Europe wasn't burning bridges. It was building new ones, away from a former mentor that had lost its way. And in the vacuum the US left behind, a new global order was settling in. China moves in. As the US clashed with its allies and weakened its own industries, China saw an opening, and it didn't hesitate. It charged in. The first big move happened quietly. A deal between Chinese battery giant CATL and a Quebec-based mining firm. The goal: long-term, stable access to lithium and cobalt, two critical resources for the EV future. The infrastructure play. Then came the next major move: the infrastructure play. BYD, China's fastest-growing electric vehicle brand, announced plans for a massive multi-billion-dollar manufacturing plant in Monterrey, Mexico. Just weeks later, NIO followed suit, forming a joint venture with Canadian suppliers to produce aluminum casings and battery modules. These weren't just business decisions. These were strategic, global chess pieces being repositioned. What made it even more concerning? These Chinese automakers weren't just exporting. They were embedding their supply chains inside North America, designed specifically to leverage the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. If their vehicles are built in Mexico or Canada, they qualify for reduced tariffs when sold in the US, even if the core components come from China. China didn't challenge American manufacturing. It quietly replaced it. Ford and GM simply can't compete with China's vertically integrated models. Tesla? Now battling competitors on its home turf, without subsidies and with a disrupted supply chain. BYD unveiled a fully electric car in Mexico City for just $28,000 and began quietly hinting at a US entry. NIO started hiring engineers in Toronto, selling them on a vision of global expansion. Meanwhile, American automakers were laying off workers, delaying product rollouts, and lobbying for government help. And back in Washington, Trump pulled the trigger. Made in America, made to fail. It began with a speech, an anthem, and a powerful promise. President Donald Trump stood at a podium and declared that American cars would once again be built with American steel, assembled by American hands, and powered by American resources. It struck a chord, tapping into nostalgia, national pride, and a deep hunger for economic revival. He signed the executive order. The message was bold: no more foreign reliance. But behind the patriotic fanfare, the harsh economic reality quickly surfaced. The US no longer had the infrastructure to support this kind of industrial comeback. Critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, vital to EV batteries, weren't produced at scale domestically. Years of offshoring and environmental hurdles had gutted American mining capacity. What remained was outdated, expensive, and far behind global standards. And then came the second blow: labor. The skilled workforce that once fueled America's manufacturing might had either aged out or moved on. Welders had retired. Machinists had taken service jobs or left their towns altogether. And with stricter immigration policies shrinking the labor pool even more, factories couldn't hire the people they needed, even if the equipment was ready. Within weeks, the cracks showed. Factories that were supposed to roar back to life stayed silent. Production lines sat still. Plans to rebuild supply chains were quietly shelved. What was sold as an industrial rebirth turned into a logistical disaster. Because patriotism doesn't mine lithium, it doesn't weld steel, it doesn't train technicians. Auto companies tried to sound the alarm in carefully worded press releases. Industry insiders whispered about collapsing timelines. But the administration stayed the course, louder, harder, as if shouting could make the factories run. The result? A nation ready to build found itself paralyzed by its own illusions. The factory shutdown spiral. What began as whispers of delays turned into a full-blown factory shutdown spiral. Ford halted production at 3 plants, citing material shortages and regulatory bottlenecks. GM slashed output in Ohio and Michigan. Stellantis announced sweeping layoffs, starting with temporary workers and expanding across entire departments. Parts suppliers, already running on razor-thin margins, couldn't hold on. Seat manufacturers in Indiana, dashboard makers in Kentucky, wiring harness firms in Wisconsin. They all depended on large volume orders from major automakers. When those dried up, they had no cushion. One by one, the lights went out. And the fallout didn't stop at the factory walls. Local diners that once served plant workers shut down. Tool and die shops, many family-run for generations, laid off their last apprentices. Towns like Flint, Toledo, and Dayton, once promised revival through protectionism, slipped back into decline. This wasn't just an economic crash, it was emotional, psychological. For these communities, the plants were more than jobs. They were legacy, pride, hope. And now? They were ghosts of a promise broken. The auto industry didn't fall because of foreign competition. It fell under the weight of a vision with no infrastructure, a promise with no plan, a slogan that couldn't withstand reality. And that's when Trump's base turned on him. The MAGA Backlash. It started with one viral video. A laid-off welder from Michigan stood outside his locked factory gates, MAGA hat in hand, asking, "Where's my job now, Mr. President?" That clip set off a wave of raw emotion across the Rust Belt. Facebook groups once dedicated to Trump 2024 became spaces of anger and betrayal. Reddit threads filled with photos of foreclosure notices, repossessed vehicles, pink slips. These weren't pundits or activists. They were factory workers, truck drivers, and lifelong assembly line veterans. And they were angry. For years, they'd stood by Trump. They believed in America first. They voted against their own economic interests, trusting that loyalty would be returned with dignity and work. Instead, they got silence, shutdowns, and slogans. The betrayal hits home. The people didn't feel betrayed by globalization. Not by Mexico, not even by China. They felt betrayed by the one politician who promised to protect them, and didn't. What started as rallies turned into protests. Chants of support became calls for accountability. Former Trump supporters began showing up at town halls, demanding answers and begging for a reversal of the very policies they had once cheered. Even conservative talk radio began to splinter. Right-wing columnists voiced concern. Republican lawmakers in battleground states quietly distanced themselves, worried about their political futures. The Republican base wasn't just fractured, it was in revolt. Trump had once lit a fire in working-class America. Now, that fire was threatening to burn down his own support. But as his base unraveled, the real pressure wasn't coming from within. It was coming from the North. The energy time bomb. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't have to issue a threat. He simply released a vague, measured statement about reviewing Canada's energy export frameworks. That was all it took. Markets panicked. Few Americans realized just how dependent the US had become on Canada, not just for oil, but for hydroelectric power, especially in states like New York, Vermont, and Maine. Now they knew. Gas prices surged by 70 cents per gallon in just 2 weeks. Rolling blackouts hit parts of the Midwest as grid instability set in. Governors tried to reassure residents while privately pleading with Ottawa for guarantees. Carney said nothing more. He didn't need to. Just the hint of a shift had sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Energy firms halted expansion. Investors braced for impact. And Washington? It had no backup plan. America's industrial machine hadn't just lost fuel. It had lost confidence. Consumers get crushed. Across the country, car dealerships have turned into ghost towns, dimly lit showrooms filled with unsold vehicles and vanishing customers. Buying a new car used to be a milestone. Now, it's a financial impossibility for millions of Americans. Even the used car market is out of reach. A 5-year-old sedan that once sold for $15,000 now goes for $25,000 or more. Rusty trucks with 100,000 miles? Still in demand, just because they exist. The costs don't stop at the purchase price. Basic maintenance and repairs have become unaffordable. A simple alternator replacement now runs close to $900, triple what it cost just a few years ago. Even an oil change can set drivers back $100 or more. Insurance premiums are rising alongside car values. A minor fender bender? It could mean thousands in repairs and soaring rates. Americans are trapped. They can't afford to buy, can't afford to fix, and can't afford to replace. Yes, EVs are growing in availability, but not in accessibility. Tesla's most affordable models now top $40,000, and charging stations remain inconsistent, especially outside urban areas. For rural Americans, the promise of an electric future feels more like a marketing slogan than a real solution. This isn't just economic strain, it's a cultural unraveling. Car ownership has long symbolized independence, freedom, and identity in the US. Now, families are putting off purchases, downsizing vehicles, or giving up ownership entirely. Rideshare signups are climbing. Used bike sales are booming. And for many, losing the ability to drive means losing a piece of who they are. The skilled labor collapse. But even for the people still clinging to their vehicles, another problem is grinding everything to a halt. There's no one left to build or fix anything. For decades, America pushed young people away from skilled trades and into college. Welding, machining, auto tech. These were dismissed as fallback jobs, not futures to be proud of. Now, that cultural mistake is coming back to haunt the country at the worst possible time. The average skilled tradesperson in the US is over 50. Retirements are accelerating, and immigration crackdowns have shrunk the foreign-born labor pool that once kept industries afloat. Apprenticeship programs? Underfunded and ignored. High schools? Most cut shop classes years ago. Trade schools? Often priced like colleges, but without the prestige or promotion. The result? A workforce crisis. Broken EVs sit untouched at service centers because no one's trained to repair them. Factory lines stall for lack of technicians. Construction crews miss deadlines waiting for pipe fitters and electricians. And it's not just the auto industry. The skilled labor shortage is hitting agriculture, energy, and infrastructure too. This crisis doesn't make headlines. It's not dramatic. It's slow and suffocating, draining industries one unfilled job at a time. America has the raw talent, but it let that talent retire, fade, or move elsewhere. And just when the country needs it most, it's gone. Japan and South Korea take over. While Washington remains paralyzed by political infighting and the US manufacturing base struggles to function, the East is stepping in. Japan and South Korea, once American allies in trade, are now replacing it in real time. Would you like me to continue this rephrasing into the Japan/South Korea section? A quiet power shift. Two countries, Japan, and South Korea have stepped into the space the US left behind. Not with headlines or fanfare, but with focus and consistency. They're not just building cars, they're building confidence. Toyota is growing its operations in Kentucky and Texas. Hyundai and Kia are expanding across Georgia and Alabama. They're hiring American workers, finishing plants on time, and delivering vehicles without the disruptions that have become common elsewhere. And American buyers have taken notice. Faced with high prices, long delays, and broken promises from legacy US automakers, consumers are switching to the brands that simply get the job done. For the first time, many are beginning to see these so-called foreign car makers as more reliable and even more American than the Detroit originals. They bring jobs, they build dependable cars, and they steer clear of the political drama that keeps disrupting the US auto industry. This isn't a takeover by force. It's a quiet shift in loyalty. American automakers, weighed down by bureaucracy, mismanagement, and years of political interference, are losing market share. Ford, GM, and Stellantis are shrinking. Dealerships are changing their inventory plans, leaning more and more on Asian-built vehicles instead of traditional American ones. And with that shift in cars comes a shift in allegiance. The question isn't how it happened. It's how long before America can recover, if it even can. The end of the empire. There was a time when driving an American car meant something. The rumble of a V8, the pride of the open road, the badge that read, "Made in the USA." That was more than a label. It was a legacy. But that legacy is slipping away. Today, the global auto industry is reorganizing, and America is no longer at the center of it. Europe is turning inward, protecting its own production lines and supply chains. Asia is surging. China now leads in EV output. Japan and South Korea own the mid-range and luxury markets. Even India is closing the gap in compact EVs and small cars. And then there's Canada. Once the quiet neighbor, now the architect of a new North American trade reality. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has executed a calculated and effective strategy. What began as a specific tariff move has grown into a full-scale shift in global trade dynamics. US car companies are shutting down plants. Labor unions are back on the defensive. And the towns that once formed the backbone of America's middle class are fading into memory. Through it all, the rest of the world kept going, investing, building, and driving forward. America wasn't just challenged, it was replaced. Is there a way back? Can the US auto industry rise again? It's possible, but it won't be easy. Rebuilding manufacturing strength, restoring skilled labor, and earning back global trust will take time. Not months, years, maybe decades, maybe. It will take more than catchy slogans or short-term incentives. It will take real vision, long-term planning, international partnerships, and above all, commitment. But while America rethinks its future, the rest of the world isn't waiting. So the real question becomes, can the US catch up again? Or has the world already moved on? A final ride? Take Harley-Davidson. Its story isn't just about one company. It reflects something deeper, what we value as riders, as a community, and as a country. So we'll end with this. Do you think Harley can make a comeback? Or is this truly the final ride? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. And if you care about the road ahead, hit that subscribe button. We're not just reporting on the ride. We're making sure it never ends.